COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc on our institutions, our society, and almost every aspect of our lives. Yet within each crisis is a silver lining, an opportunity to reinvent ourselves, to discover a new path, and to take a leap of faith into the life we want to live. I know from speaking with a lot of you that this includes finding more meaningful and rewarding work. COVID has shown us that life is too short to do work that doesn't make us come alive and allow us to contribute to a better world. If you enjoyed this episode and you're interested in the topics we discussed, you might want to learn more about the profession of health coaching and what it has to offer. We've put together a resource page that explains what a health coach is. Hint, it's probably not what you think. How training as a health coach can change your life as well as your future clients' lives, and an ebook about what a career as a health coach might look like. You can find it all for free at kresser.co/discover. That's kresser.co/discover. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman as my guest. Dr. Kaufman is a humanistic psychologist exploring the depths of human potential, and he's the author of a book that I recently read called Transcend, the New Science of Self-actualization. Dr. Kaufman's actually the author of several other books and several publications. He received a PhD in cognitive science from Yale and has taught at Columbia, NYU, and the University of Pennsylvania. And he also hosts the Psychology Podcast, which is the #1 psychology podcast in the world. But Transcend was my introduction to Dr. Kaufman, and it was one of the best books I've read in a very long time. The more I have worked with patients over a decade now and been doing this work for 13, 14 years, the more convinced I've become that our mindset, our psychology, how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to the world around us is just as important as the diet that we eat, whether we get enough exercise and sleep, how we manage our stress, etc. But it's often excluded from conversations about health and well-being. And, I've seen this in my own experience, my own journey with chronic illness. I've also seen it in working with hundreds, if not thousands, of patients now and training hundreds of practitioners and health coaches. And I think COVID even shined the light on this further. There are things that happen in life that we don't always have control over, and how we respond to those things, how we hold ourselves, how we relate to other people is really what determines the quality of our day-to-day experience, and that in turn has a powerful impact on our health and our well-being and our resistance to disease and all the stuff that we talk about in terms of preventing and reversing chronic disease and living as long of a health span as we can. So in this episode, we're going to talk more about the idea of self-actualization and transcendence, how Dr. Kaufman got interested in this and the role that it's played in his work. We'll talk about how being well is not always about feeling good, which is a concept that I've shared over the years, and I was really interested to see it in Dr. Kaufman's book as well. We'll talk about how being well came to be associated with always feeling good, particularly in the U.S., I think, and other Western or industrialized societies. We'll talk about the role of meaning and purpose and what the different forms of meaning are and how they contribute to health and well-being. We'll talk about a concept called post-traumatic growth. We've all heard about PTSD and post-traumatic stress, but there is another possible response to trauma, which is growth, and those can even coexist. So we're going to talk more about that. We'll talk about the growing body of research suggesting that loneliness and lack of social connection have a powerful impact on our life, and much more. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Definitely one of my favorite shows, and look forward to hearing your feedback. All right, I bring you Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. I've really been looking forward to this.
Oh, Dr. Kresser, it's so exciting to talk to you. I've heard such great things about you.
I think I mentioned this to you in the email when I originally reached out. Back in like 1998 to mid to halfway through to the year 2000, I was living at the Esalen Institute and used to spend a lot of time in the Maslow room there.
Awesome.
And this is, I got really interested at that point in the heritage of Esalen and all of the people that were involved, and started reading Maslow's books. And that was my introduction to his work. So how did you become interested in Maslow's work specifically, and then in the idea of self-actualization and transcendence more generally?
Yeah, I can definitely answer those questions, but maybe we could tell your listeners how Maslow encountered Esalen Institute.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be
He,
fun.
he'd never heard of Esalen Institute. Actually, at the time, it wasn't called Esalen. It was called something Lodge, I think.
Right.
And
Yeah.
um, and he and his wife Bertha were riding where they got lost, and near that Esalen area, the
Yeah.
hills are very steep, and
Yes.
it's kind of scary. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
you hear the rocks and you hear the water hitting against the rocks, and you're windy, and they're like, we need to stay somewhere, we need to get off the road, it's too dark. And so they just pulled into this place that Maslow described as like a spooky place at the end of nowhere, I think is what he told Michael Murphy that it looked like. And when he got there, there was this really like gruff Chinese man at the front counter who said, "What do you want?" And Maslow said, "Hey, my wife Bertha and I would really like to stay here tonight." And he said, "Write your name here." And yeah, and Maslow wrote his name down, and the guy looked at down and saw it and said, Abraham Maslow. One of the co-founders, Dick Price, came running in, and was like, "Abraham Maslow, we built this whole thing based on your principles
Yes.
and and then he showed them all the copies of the book they had everywhere, and later on Maslow would end up becoming quite good friends with the co-founders of Esalen, and then be quite a part of it. But it's just really funny how that happened.
It is. That's a legendary story that gets told all the time at Esalen. And my little tiny post part in that was that I when I was at Esalen, I worked as a gate guard. So I was the guy who was checking people in when they arrived, and met some pretty interesting people that way, as you can imagine, as well. So, um,
Amazing.
yeah. So how did you get interested in Maslow's work and in self-actualization and transcendence?
Well, I've been interested in this simplicity, I've been interested in the idea of self-transcendence my whole career, and well, self-actualization for sure. Even as a little kid, I was very curious why some people were fulfilling their potential, others weren't, and differences in talent and ability fascinated me. I started to study the science of intelligence when I was in college. I actually grew up with a learning disability, an auditory learning disability, and it really motivated me to want to understand like the limitations of human potential. And when I finally got a chance, it's a long story, but when I finally got a chance to study it in college, I started off studying intelligence, like the science of intelligence, like what is it, like what are individual differences in intelligence, why do people differ in it, and how do you measure it? But I realized that it really was human potential and self-actualization that was really what interested me. I don't think it became as clear to me as it did until I encountered Maslow's writings and the rest of the humanistic psychologists. When I was at University of Pennsylvania about 5, 6 years ago, I was teaching a course on positive psychology for undergrads there, and I was preparing a lecture on the history of the field of positive psychology. And I was reading a textbook, and I was reading some of the descriptions of Maslow's descriptions of self-actualizing people, and it really resonated with me. I loved that way of thinking. I love those characteristics. Like those characteristics didn't overlap much at all with modern day, even positive psychology characteristics of happy people. Like I always felt something was missing in the field of positive psychology. I was like, well, the characteristics of happy people might not be the same thing as the characteristics of self-actualizing people. And that was really exciting to go down that rabbit hole. And boy, was that a rabbit hole I went down. It led to this book.
Yes, yes. So what is the difference from your perspective in the characteristics of self-actualizing versus happy people? How do you, and maybe you could define those terms as far as how you think of them. What is self-actualization? What is transcendence? And how do those differ from what we are pointing to when we say happiness?
I think self-actualization, the way Maslow thought of is what is that unique potentiality within you that can make the biggest impact, that can like when fully realized makes you feel most alive, creative. Aliveness was a really a big one. Humanistic psychologists were very curious to understand what does it mean to be an experientially alive human. They were interested in science, but they were also very interested in the experiential aspect of humanity. When people are feeling well, when people are feeling like they have a life of meaning, what is that experience like, versus depression and sadness? Self-actualization, I think a lot of humanist psychologists really saw it as that unique capability in you that without it, you're not all that you could be. There are basic needs that have to be met. We all want to have, to a certain degree, have some connections. We want some safety. We want a lot of safety. We want to feel like we matter. We want to feel a sense of self-esteem, like healthy pride that we're accomplishing something, that we're competent in some way, that we're authors of our own life story. But we all want those things. Self-actualization is this thing. It's like, what is really unique about me?
Hmm.
What can I really uniquely contribute to the world? Self-transcendence, Maslow really got into the last couple of years of his life. He saw it as a higher motivation than the need for self-actualization. And so then he started to distinguish between his non-transcending self-actualizers and his transcending self-actualizers. And so that was an insight he had just in his personal journal. I think I printed the journal entry in my
I
book
remember
Transcend.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just make sure I'm tracking you. Transcendence is self-actualization that is dedicated to let's say, a higher purpose or a purpose other than your own gratification or personal advancement.
Self-transcendence
Yeah.
is less clearly defined.
Mhm.
Uh, and Maslow wrote an unpublished essay. It was like a certain number of like maybe 46 different definitions of transcendence. He wanted to illustrate the fact that people can use it in lots of different ways. What I tried to do is present a definition of transcendence in my book that integrated all those definitions, that would be an umbrella that would encapsulate many different meanings of the word transcendence. I define transcendence as this emergent property of integration of your whole self in the service of realizing the good society. So when there's a certain so my idea of transcendence is very much more horizontal than vertical. You're not above anyone when you're striving and motivated for transcendence. It's not like you're motivated to be like enlightened and no one else is enlightened. It's the psychologists actually call it the I'm enlightened and you're not enlightened effect that narcissists have.
Right.
It's not about spiritual narcissism. It's about how can I be so integrated within myself that that there's a great synergy between my being and the world, so that what is good for me is automatically good for the world. That's a very high level of integration, and I think that starts to get us to a very healthy form of transcendence.
I like that definition. So, how does this relate to happiness? We just recent show with second show episode with Robert Biswas Diener, and then I
Beautiful,
had Ken and Sheldon on recently, and we've talked
beautiful.
about different perspectives on happiness and eudaimonia, and these other concepts. So, can a person be self-actualized and unhappy? Can a person be
Oh yes,
happy without being self-actualized?
oh yes,
How do all these intersect?
yes, and yes. Big fans of both of those legends that you just mentioned. I drew a lot on Ken Sheldon's work in my purpose chapter and had just delightful conversations with him. I think he read a draft of the chapter to get his feedback. Yeah, I draw a lot on their work. I draw a lot on a lot of the legends in the field of positive psychology. But the idea of happiness, I think people define it in different ways, and even within the field of positive psychology, some people would define happiness as just life satisfaction and positive emotions. So how satisfied are you with your life, and an evaluative component to your life overall, and how much frequency of joy do you have in your life? To me, that both of those things are divorced from self-actualization, quite frankly. They could, in fact, they could be zero overlap between the two.
Zero
Between
correlation.
There could be actually there.
Yeah.
I could see a case. I could see a case where someone is really being all they could be. Their talents are used to the full. They're really contributing that unique potentiality within them. They're being creative, um, but they're always striving for more. They don't feel a valuative, life satisfaction. They're not
Mhm.
satisfied. They don't even, quite frankly, want to be satisfied. Like, because they know that it's more important to satisfy others, you
Mhm.
know like, and especially when you get to the level of self-transcendence, you really do get to a kind of motivation that is beyond health, beyond happiness. This is actually what Maslow called it. He said it beyond health, but I'm going to now say beyond happiness as well. It's a stage, or it's like a form of consciousness, that Maslow called it theory Z, and that's what I tried to, like, complete his theory Z. That's what I tried.
Mhm.
But no one's heard of theory Z. But yeah, I bet you have. I bet you have.
Yes,
You feel
I
it. I feel like
have.
you're like a fellow traveler. I feel like you're a
Yeah,
fellow
I
traveler in
think
this
so.
space, which is very, very, makes this conversation very exciting at a very deep level. But I think that thinking about that level of transcendence, that level of consciousness where you're beyond happiness, where happiness is not the motivation. So, it's about motivations, right? Like, if your primary motivation is transcendence, well, then, you can live without happiness every now and then, you know? Like, it's like, when your primary motivation is food, well, that's your primary motivation. So you can't live without food.
Right.
When your primary motivation is connection, you feel like if one person rejects you, you're going to die. When your primary motive, you can be locked into a primary motivation of any of these 7 needs that I talk about in my book. But when the B values, like the values, the values of being themselves, they're things there's no further things you want from them, but they are goods in themselves. You strive for justice, you strive for beauty, more meaningfulness in your life,
Hmm.
more perfection, more. Maslow had a whole list of B values. Uh, I'm trying to think of one more. Do you remember?
I
Excellence, excellence.
Excellence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
Mm.
one. I mean, I think of people like Gandhi, of course, and Mother Teresa,
Mm.
who devoted their lives to big social problems that they made a huge impact on. And one could imagine that they weren't happy and cheery all the time. That in their quest for to achieve their goals, they were enduring a lot of hardships, and intentionally in both cases, right? A lot of deprivation and hardships, and yet nobody could argue that their lives weren't just imbued with rich meaning and purpose and value, and everybody knows their names. And so that is a really interesting dialectic there between those concepts. I want to make another analogy, that you alluded to, or referred to in your book, which is, I found as a functional medicine clinician over the years, that the idea of what health is often kind of not interrogated or questioned, and there's a default assumption that health is simply the absence of disease or symptoms, in the same way that we might assume that happiness, or some people define happiness as just feeling good all the time, or living a meaningful life as feeling good all the time. But you talk about in the book, I think this is a direct quote: being well is not always about feeling good. It also involves continually incorporating more meaning, engagement, and growth in one's life, key themes in humanistic psychology. And I'd like to discuss this broader definition of health with you, because it's become a key theme in my work, that health is not just feeling great at the top of your game every day, that there's a much broader concept of health, which includes how you relate to yourself, how you relate to the world around you, the sense of meaning and purpose, and connection with others. And it's so much further beyond just not having any pain or dysfunction in your body. So um, yeah, I'd love to just talk a little bit more about that. Does that come out? I know that that can come out of somewhat out of Maslow's work and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. There's a lot of discussion about that, because of people being in the most extreme, challenging circumstances and still being able to to find some meaning and value there.
Yeah, we're very much aligned on that. I love that, and I love the work you're doing. I'm working on a book right now with a former student of mine, Jordan Feingold, who just finished med school. She's now a doctor. I'm very proud of her, and she is trying to start the field of positive medicine.
That's great.
That takes it's just such great alignment with what you're doing. I'd love to make an intro if
Please.
you would be interested.
Hmm.
But what we're working on together is a workbook for post-traumatic growth, and especially to help people maybe reframe and see what they could learn from, and even grow, dare I say, from the past year and the year and a half. But this reframing is really, it's on the surface, it may not seem so profound, but in practice, if one really puts into practice this way of thought that you have just outlined, it is quite revolutionary on the whole system, because it's a very whole system view, right? And that's really what humanistic psychologists were interested in at the end of the day, is how's all this stuff integrated, and how does all this stuff in all the parts of the system interact to produce, something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Like what you're talking to right now, whatever this being is, I know, from my
Hmm.
perspective, what I think this being is, but this being is an integrated emergence of a lot of parts, and I would quite frankly not like to be identified with any one of those parts, please. But so the question is, how do we combine all this stuff, integrate, accept, fully accept. We accept our pain, right? It could be physical pain, but we can accept our emotional pain, in certain ways that we integrate, and that changes the emergence. All these decisions we make change that emergent being, right? So
So you speak a little bit about this in your book, like this idea that being well is just feeling good all the time,
mm.
that often is unquestioned, but it's not necessarily the way that people look at it all around the world, is it? Because
Well, there's definitely cultural
is there
differences.
something cultural, uniquely Western about that idea?
Yeah, there there's something uniquely Western about, the search for happiness, in term as a search for feeling well, good, because other people
Hmm.
might actually view happiness. You could see, like, Eastern philosophy perspectives, happiness being wisdom. Like
Right.
Americans, it doesn't feel very American as apple pie, does it? That happiness is wisdom. It doesn't, so it just
No.
like doesn't feel American. Um, but yeah, no, you're certainly right. There's also cultural differences in terms of, um, well, certainly collective versus individualistic pursuits, and even notions of self-actualization itself. There's something that I've enjoyed doing from this book, is to have communication with indigenous people, about their kind of notions of self-realization, and it's very grounded in the collective actualization
Right.
and community. I think that if there's something that is missing from my book, a big thing that's missing from my book, um, and if I, in the future for other books, I would, maybe there'll be a 10th year anniversary edition someday or something. I want to talk more about the importance of community.
Mm.
And I think that's super, super important, and something that, Americans, I mean, we love it, we appreciate it, but it's not incorporated so much into our conceptualizations of happiness, is it?
Right. No, it's very, we're the very roots of the nation are individualistic, right?
Mm.
And the founding of the country was based on that strong ethos of individualism, perhaps more than any other country in the world, I think. I want to come back to community because I share your passion for, how that relates to our own sense of self and wellness. But before we move on to that, staying with the theme of health being something more than just feeling good all the time, and bringing in meaning and purpose, which you covered in your book, and your discussions with Ken Sheldon about this. It seems to me, in not an exhaustive study, but I'm a pretty prolific reader, and biography is my one of my
Mm.
favorite genres. So I've probably read, I don't know, 150 biographies of famous notable people over the years. And I haven't done it, like I said, any formal analysis, but I'm going to say off the top of my head that at least 80% of those people were dealing with some significant health challenge. Um, and I would say not necessarily despite that, but maybe even in part because of that, they were able to transform that challenge into some seed of opportunity or creative urge or new insight or new way of seeing the world that wouldn't have been there if it weren't for their challenge. And that sense of purpose and meaning of transforming that and offering it to other people is in part what allowed them to achieve what they were able to achieve. And I'm just curious if you have a similar idea or have come across that, or what your thoughts are about that idea.
Well, there is good research suggesting that you can do systematic analyses, and you do find a larger percentage of eminent people have had physical disabilities than the general population.
Mm.
There's a beautiful book about that. I'm trying to remember the title of it, like When Doors Become Pathways or something. Like, can you edit stuff out if I
Yeah,
could
we
find
can
it
we
real
can put it
quick?
in the show notes for sure. Yeah, you can send it to us and we'll put it in the
It's
show
called
notes.
When Walls Become Doorways: Creativity and the Transforming Illness by Toby Zausner. I
Oh,
mean, she
Zausner,
presented,
yeah.
yeah, she,
Mhm.
she presented analysis of the biographies of eminent painters who suffered from physical illnesses and
Yes.
concluded that these illnesses led to the creation of new possibilities for their art by breaking old habits, provoking equilibrium, and forcing the artist to generate alternative strategies to reach their creative goals. So
Yeah.
there's something very powerful about that. I also, one of actually the first public article I ever wrote was for Psychology Today, 2008. It was called Confessions of a Late Bloomer. And I did my own analysis of that, and found, that a lot of people are late bloomers because their potential was squashed, but that potential being squashed actually is what led to them being an amazing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, achiever, a creative achiever at some point. So, yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say about that topic. It's very passionate about it. Not just physical, but I would add mental illness to
Yes.
this mix. I would add neurodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I'm working personally with kids on the autism spectrum who are geniuses. I work in the field of TUI, twice exceptionality,
Yeah.
and these kids simultaneously have some disability. A lot of my physical disabilities, a lot of my mental disabilities, mental difficulties, learning difficulties. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the word disability, but
Yeah, we need a
um,
better term for sure.
mm, mm,
Differences. I mean, it's what's clear in the 2E. What I love about the 2E movement is, and I would just extend this broadly to all health challenges,
mm.
is the understanding that, for someone with ADHD, for example, the nervous system functions differently. And there are some things that are challenging about that. And there are some things that are actually really amazing about that and that confer that person with almost supernatural abilities. And if you can look at like famous entrepreneurs like Richard Branson and, you know, all kinds of different personalities that were again able to achieve what they did, not in spite of, in this case, their ADHD, but largely because of it. Because someone with ADHD is constantly looking for the next novelty and the next new thing, and looking at and not satisfied with things as they are. They don't tolerate boredom very well, so they're they're not going to be a person that just goes to the job in the cubicle and stays there for 40 years. They're going to go on to the next thing.
Well, you're saying a lot of things where I'm just nodding. I keep nodding my head. I'm like, yes, yes, brother, yes. I mean, you just go down the list. You see all these ways that a lot of things society says that things are absolutely disabilities or absolutely difficulties in certain contexts, can be very, very valuable, and can lead to amazing creative breakthroughs. Being an outsider, another one I'm really interested in, is or even just being an immigrant to this country, or being in a different field and
Yeah.
trying to make a contribution to a field, having what psychologists this is a phrase that creative psychologists that psychologists of creativity have called it unusual experiences. So the extent to which people can have unusual experiences tends to lead to creativity. They did this really cool study where they had people, they put them in a virtual reality environment, and they kind of reversed all the normal things, like for instance the laws of physics were reversed, and as you get closer to something, like the object is the opposite of its spatiality and that it's supposed to be. And they also asked people to, like, well, if you put like cereal in your if you put like milk in your cereal first, like put it in last, or like put in the milk first, whatever, do change
Right.
up your routine, change
Yeah.
up the routine.
Yeah.
And they found that that led to greater divergent thinking, just even in that like 15-minute psychology study. So
Yeah.
imagine like building that up to like every day of your freaking life,
Yeah.
growing up as a kid, without these unusual experiences from others.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes perfect sense to me. It's all part of the neuroplasticity, what neuroplasticity has helped us to understand about forming those pathways. So yeah, I mean, for me, my listeners know about my own experience. I had a pretty severe chronic illness in my early 20s while I
Mm,
was traveling. I got really sick while I was traveling in Indonesia, and it's I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you if that hadn't happened. I wouldn't have entered the field of functional medicine. I wouldn't have written books about it. I wouldn't have learned to care for myself in the way that I have. I'm almost certain of that because I was essentially forced to do that. If I didn't do that, I was going to die. I was pretty much that straightforward. And
amazing.
I wouldn't have developed the relationships that I've developed. I wouldn't have been married to my wife. I'm almost certain that because I wouldn't have been in the type of environment where I met her. And I'm there's just a really interesting razor's edge from like a physical and I think mental health standpoint too, where yes, we want to do everything we can to improve our subjective experience, our health and well-being, our energy levels, smooth digestion, all the things that we want. And at the same time, I've seen a growing I have a growing concern with the kind of obsessive focus on that at almost at the exclusion of everything else. And I can just give you like a really practical example where
Yeah.
someone with a chronic illness might just stay up for 4 hours after online, like researching cure, the next thing to do, or going to like see the next doctor. And I get that, like I've been there myself. But what if that some of that time at least was spent playing with your dog or your kid, or playing practicing guitar, like learning a new instrument, or volunteering at the local animal shelter, or something that's actually going to produce a different quality of experience in your life.
Mm,
And ironically, or maybe not ironically, that actually then does lead to a virtuous cycle that creates more health instead of the more direct path of like, I have to figure out how to cure this problem and get rid of every symptom that's associated with it. It's a tricky balance.
yeah. And a lot, and as you very well know, a lot of traditional doctors um, would hard for them to wrap their head around that concept, that maybe we shouldn't focus on the most immediate medicine, like, or the most immediate physical remedy. Maybe we should actually first target the mind. I mean, that's that's like speaking a different language to some people. This is why we need to think of this as a whole person sort of perspective, and change medicine along those lines. Again, like, I'm just so proud of my former student Jordan. I'm such a dork. I keep talking about her because she was like my best student ever. Like, I remember,
Yeah.
like, she was an undergrad at Penn, and just how, and now she's doing this positive medicine work, but along these lines. But it's just, I think that's it's a really, in certain circles, a revolutionary way to think about it. But I'm going to give you an analogy because I think about this as well in terms of psychotherapy practice,
Hmm.
and I've argued that one of the best ways, like a lot of people who suffer from neuroticism, or like constant ruminating, negative rumination about themselves, or even like narcissism, and especially a form of narcissism I've studied called vulnerable narcissism, which really makes people prone to depression because they don't feel like they're being appreciated enough. When they end up on the therapist couch, I like to think that the best the best way to help that person is to help them stop thinking so much about themselves. And I've said this, I've tweeted this out, stuff like this, had you ever occurred to you
Right.
that maybe the best path out of the neurotic hell you're in is, to get outside yourself in some way.
Right.
And so I just see a great analogy there between a lot of stuff you're doing and what you're saying there, and the kind of transcendence work I'm trying to infuse into psychotherapy practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'd love to meet Jordan because it sounds we probably have a lot to
Mm,
talk about. I mean, in the last few years and in my own experience, like when I was really struggling still with the physical symptoms and the illness, I just intuitively figured out that I call it now zooming in and zooming out. Like there were times where I needed to focus on seeing doctors and taking supplements and special diets and things to improve my physical symptoms. But I also noticed over time that if I only did that, my life was pretty miserable. Like it didn't really feel like it was worth living when that was the only thing that I was focused on. And part of how this was actually how I ended up at Esalen, because I had reached a point where I was exhausted from just attending to the physical aspects of the illness. And I wanted to explore the emotional and the psycho-spiritual side of things and see what I could learn from that. And I also just knew that I had to have more pleasure and joy in my life, and that Esalen was a pretty good place to, you know, to get that and to
yeah.
practice that. And sure enough, as you could probably predict, just the experience of that pleasure and joy and the exploration and everything that came with that really shifted my health in a way that I don't think more strict diets and more, the right kind of supplements and all of that stuff, which I have, of course, deep respect for, and is something I do still in my work. But I'm just really increasingly encouraging my patients and listeners to, to explore these other dimensions as valid and powerful pathways to greater health and well-being.
I love it. I mean, if you look at the effect of stress on like our epigenetics, it can be quite profound in lots of ways. And I've seen the research on what it does to the body when you have, um, uh, for instance, um, did you know that they did this big analysis of on Twitter of different words that are used and its link to heart disease?
No, I didn't.
So
Tell me
they
about that.
found they can look county by county, and they found the counties where on Twitter they tended to use words that were coded to be more like curse words and like negative, like negative ruminations and things.
Uh-huh.
The people in those counties, it predicted the county level, the amount of heart disease in that county. And what was interesting is that they found that these predictions of being able to these machine learning algorithms that were able to collate all of this wealth of data just from the words people used, their consciousness, the output of their consciousness, that was a better predictor of heart disease than every other cause of mortality that they looked at combined. Combined. I have a
It's
chart. I have literally the chart that shows better. You can look at cholesterol levels. You can look at and actually the
smoking,
words they
body
used on
mass
Twitter.
index, all
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
chart where it's like they have all combined, and you just see the bar the is much bigger for for Twitter language. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And it reminds me of a study that I frequently talk about that showed, and this we can, segue into this as well, because I know you talk about it in your book, and we can use this to come back to community and the importance of community. This study that found that social isolation and loneliness were greater risk factors for
Mm,
early death than anything else, and often by a very large margin, greater than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, for example, greater than having high blood pressure, greater than having high body mass index. Like not having
yeah.
true confidant, not having people that you could confide in, not having a sense of place or community turns out to be more of a threat for early death than any of these traditional risk factors that we consider.
Yeah, when I read those statistics, I'm neurotic, so I started to like just be so terrified of ever being too lonely. Like, I would be like, could I just spontaneously have a heart attack because I feel really lonely? Yeah. But it's not to make light of a very, very important finding. Um This research is groundbreaking, and Cacioppo, John Cacioppo did so much revolutionary research on that, and um, he passed away recently. I don't think it was from loneliness, but it was from something
Mm.
else. But he was a legend, in this field, and really documented a lot of those findings you're talking about.
So if we fast forward into the future, it's the 10-year anniversary of Transcend, and you have a chance to add a chapter on community. What would it contain? What would the thesis be or the main ideas be?
Oh boy, I really do, because look, here's the thing. I want to admit my blindsidedness, because I've learned a lot from learning even just more about indigenous perspectives. I think that there's a beauty to the whole concept of community actualization. You know, um, the word self-actualization just in it of itself feels individualistic.
Selfish? Yeah,
I mean, it's like yourself, but
yeah.
but the idea of what is community actualization? What does it mean to live in a particular community where all the inhabitants really truly care about the welfare of the whole of the, like self-actualization. I talk a lot about caring about the whole of yourself and integrating yourself. But I think that maybe that's my not my next book, but someday a book on what does it mean to have an integrated community. So every individual feels like they matter, they belong, and that their talents and unique strengths are being actualized, but also that they just, it not only like do we just care about them because they're unique talents and strengths, we care about them because they're human. Something that also blew my mind was reading the research on how we treat the elderly in America,
Yeah,
and
it's
contrasting
horrific.
that with, it's horrific. And looking at other, like Icaria, looking at other, in Greece, there's a place called Icaria where they live to over 100 on average. And the old people say we forget to die because people, and I was reading, descriptions of how they treat the elderly there. And they're like, of course, if we would never exclude someone from our community. So I think the idea of community actualization is extremely important.
Yeah, I really agree, and it's something that's becoming more important for me. I've been talking recently about what I call the ecosystem of health and disease, where we recognize that health and disease are not just individual endeavors, right? We have this idea that we're in full control of our health, which we're not. We have a lot of influence, and more influence than conventional medicine often recognizes. We're not just passive recipients of medication. But on the other hand, let's imagine if I grew up in an inner city neighborhood where the air quality was horrible, where there's lead in the water, which is still happening in many cities around the world, where I live in a food desert, I don't have access to grocery stores that have fresh produce. I grew up in a very traumatic situation. Um, where does the self end and begin and end in that situation? Like that person's health and well-being from a mental and physical perspective is inexorably intertwined with the context and environment in which they grew up. And that can it doesn't even have to be that dramatic of an example. It can be just from like whether we were breastfed as an infant and whether we were born via C-section or vaginal birth. Like these are things that we obviously didn't have any say over, any control over, and yet they very much impact our health, just as the health of our community that we're living in now does, from in terms of things like water and air, but also just the words people are using, to your point from Twitter study, and what else is happening around us. So it does seem to me that an excessive focus on self, at least as it's narrowly defined, misses a lot of important parts of pieces of the puzzle.
Oh, for sure. This is a rabbit hole that I'm sure you don't want to go down, but I I get in a lot of debates with Sam Harris over whether or not we have free will or not. And
A
like
big topic.
we had like a 2-part 4-hour debate that was not settled on my podcast about that. And if you take his view, that, I mean, because you said something like, well, they don't have control over where they were born and whether or not they were born, through the vaginal canal, and right. But
Right.
but do we have any control over what do we? But let's go even further. Like, what do we actually have? Do we have control over the genes that we were born with? Do we have control over the genes that would code for traits, psychological traits like grit and resiliency? Now, look, some people, you can take two people and they can be in the same exact environment, and some people, because of their personality disposition, actually are more likely to succeed than someone else. So there are individual differences in that. There's individual differences in, dare I say, cognitive ability that are predictive. We can't just sweep that under the rug as completely irrelevant. It's all the environment. There are individual personality and cognitive dispositions that play a role. But I think that kind of thinking about the fact that none of us chose that can maybe give us compassion for others, and also maybe make us realize, not take so much credit, for our own successes, to make us want to help others. I think there actually could be a hopeful way of viewing the situation, where you recognize the role of luck is much more pervasive. What I'm trying to do is take what you said and even go in further and say,
Yeah.
look, the pervasiveness of luck, actually, I can tell you it pervades heck of a lot of things, even the psychological level, that we take for granted, especially people who then become successful. These success magazine stories about how I became rich and
Yeah.
famous.
Yeah, you got lucky. No, I mean, of course. Again, this is another area with very deep rabbit hole, and
Sure.
I love it. As let's do that at some point, but maybe
Sounds
not
good.
in this venue. But I do want to
Sounds
kind of expand on that a little bit, because the flip side of that is bad luck, right? Like we have good luck, we have bad luck. It was bad luck for me that I happened to be in the surfing at a break where
Hmm.
locals had dug a trench between some stagnant water that cows were defecating in, and that water went out into the river, through the river mouth into the surf break, and I swallowed some of it and I got extremely sick. But was that bad luck or was that good luck? Because that led to a whole bunch of other things that happened later on, and I don't know
Right.
who's in control of that. But I don't, even though I'm intellectually fascinated by the discussion around that, from a practical perspective, what interests me more is what you alluded to. What can result, how does my relationship with myself change when I
Hmm.
accept that I'm not in full control? And how does my relationship with other people change? Well, there's some interesting ways that it can change. One is more compassion and empathy for myself. Like, wow, I'm doing the best I can. I got hit with something like totally out of my control, and
Right.
now I'm just gonna, it's not like the guilt, blame, and shame game. It's responsibility. I love that word. To me, means ability to respond. Like,
Hmm.
how am I going to respond? Am I able to
Hmm.
respond? And rather than who's to blame, who's in control, like that can turn into a whole um distraction, I think. And it's just like, okay, I got sick for various reasons. What am I going to do? How am I going to be able to respond? How can I treat myself with empathy and compassion? How can I treat others who are dealing with those kinds of problems with empathy and compassion? That's the part of that whole free will discussion that's interesting to me, at least in the context of chronic illness or any kind of chronic issue that we might be dealing with.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, look, we should write an article together coining a new term called responsibility. It's
I
not
like it.
responsibility. It's we literally, I'm giving you credit. You literally just coined a new phrase that can have its own meaning. RESPONSEABILITY.
I like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like it. Yeah, it's
Anyway,
been a powerful concept for me because
beautiful.
it's the word that the way that word is typically used has such a heavy kind of
Hmm.
connotation to it, and this is much more prosaic. It's just like, are you able to respond? How I'm not in
Yeah.
control of what happens, but I do have some, and this is where Sam Harris will disagree with me, but I do have some ability to respond. I do have some influence over how I respond, or it appears that I might. Again,
At least
we
you
could go
fooled you.
down.
At least you fooled yourself. You fooled yourself into thinking that you had some control over that.
That's
But
what he would say. Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I'm a compatibilist, so I tend to defend there are free will is worth wanting,
Yeah,
and that's one of them. Also, your capacity. I think a big free will worth wanting is your capacity to error correct and be able to inhibit impulses that once seemed impossible to inhibit. Like the person who I mean, I stand at wonder and awe at people who overcome addictions, and they say I'm 1 2 years 3 years sober. I mean, that's really truly grounds for celebration, right? Because there was a time in that person's life where they wouldn't even imagine that it'd be possible for them to go a day, more than a day, without it. And here they are, and they got to a point where they're 3 years 4 years sober. So to me, that speaks to incredible aspect of the human will.
I agree.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's also, yeah. I'm tempted to go there, but I'm going to stop myself because just
We
like
have
you
a
said,
lot to riff
that can
on.
turn into a 4 hour discussion. But
Yeah.
I want to refer back to something you mentioned, and it was in the context of our previous conversation, but it's something I talked with Ken Sheldon about, and I'm really fascinated with myself, which is post-traumatic growth.
Mm.
So I mean, I'm always careful to be clear about this when I talk about it, that I'm not denying the existence of PTSD and the reality of PTSD and the very real impact that trauma has on people, and the myriad ways that can affect one's life in throughout someone's entire lifespan, even if that trauma was happened at birth. So I have a deep appreciation and respect for that. And as someone who's been through some pretty intense trauma and has been able to grow from it, I think to some degree, I also have a deep appreciation and respect for the opportunity that trauma can present. So how do we look at that, and what is it that enables somebody to grow post traumatically versus not to grow, not to walk through that door that could get, or even see the door that happens in the case of trauma.
Yeah, I love all those caveats, and there are research studies showing quite clearly that people don't prefer that the trauma happened.
Right.
That's not what we're saying, and
Mm-hmm.
it often gets misconstrued that way. Like um, there's such a poignant story of this rabbi who lost his son, and he said, I would give up all of the growth, all of the increased connections and spirituality I had since my son's death in a moment if it meant I could get my son back. So
Yes.
um, I just want to be very clear. That's true. But the question is, you can't get your son back. He can't. And um, Irving Yalom, existential psychotherapist, who's a big influence on me, he says, you must give up hope that the past will change. To really, really think about that. Really think about that. You know,
I
and that
love
deep.
that quote. I just have to stop you, and so you say
Mm.
it again. Give up hope that the
You must
past will
give up hope
change.
that the past will ever change. It's not going to be
Right.
different. So what choice do you have, right? And not only what choice do you have, but what opportunities do you have? And it turns out there are a lot of opportunities that these things can afford us, that they can still fill up our bucket of meaning, like even when all else has felt lost. Because I mean, what are the alternatives? When you're in like the pit of despair and you feel like all has been lost, um, what's the harm in adding a little meaning to your life in that moment, right?
Right.
Of course, that's a silly thing. What's the harm? The question is, what enrichment to your life would it give? A lot, a
Mhm.
lot. We're in the business of helping people go from -50 to +50, right? Not just saying, you're at -50 and well, just stay there, you know.
Right. 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 This is something that comes up a lot. One of the things that we do is we have a health coach certification program. As you may know, health coaching is firmly rooted in positive psychology and
Mm-hmm.
cultivating character strengths and building psychological capital, and the acronym HERO: hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And so there's often a lot of discussion about this, like how do we take something, and then of course with COVID, the last year and a half, I've talked a lot about it as well. Like how do we take something that by for most people and by most accounts is like a pretty ranges from a terrible nuisance and a change in almost every aspect in life, to all the way up to death and serious disability and disease. How do we transform that? Like what? And even for someone just who's listening to this, who might, it's not COVID related, maybe they just were diagnosed with an autoimmune disease or cancer, or maybe they're struggling with serious depression or some other um, mood or behavioral disorder. How can they, what does the literature say, and just our own experience, how can they cultivate the response ability? How can they, what are the things we can do to cultivate that ability to grow post-traumatically?
I think a lot of it comes down to how you process the trauma. And also there is a certain time course. I think that you don't want to, you never force people to do any of this stuff if they're not ready. Um, my gosh, like if you've just lost a loved one, you don't, the day after the funeral, you don't say, okay, time to grow, like it's like,
Right.
get the
No.
freak out of
Yeah.
here with
You're
that
going to get
bullshit,
punched in the
right?
face. Yeah.
Let's have some compassion for the humanity of the suffering as well, right? And the
Yeah.
necessary sort of experience of that, and not diminish that. The value of just pure, there's can be value sometimes in just pure suffering. That might be a controversial statement in itself, but I think that helping the person process it over time in a way that is productive, that will add meaning to their life, is in a more deliberate way. See, the thing is, most people, it's very common human experience when you've had trauma for it to be very automatic, like automatic intrusions of, well, I could have done something different, or um, you just keep thinking of the incident over and over again. Like you see that a lot with post-traumatic stress, right? Um,
Sure.
but and that's the default response, to trauma. But there are skills that can be learned to more deliberately take control of those ruminations. So not saying that those intrusions and ruminations are going to go away. That's not the goal, but the goal is to take control of them. And I really like Jamie Pennebaker's work. I really like the idea of the importance of journaling, the importance of getting your emotions out, and reflecting on the experience on paper, or electronically, to really have discussions with people about what could be the larger meaning. Intentional post-traumatic growth. We call it intentional post-traumatic growth. It's possible. It's possible to learn skills of hope. So Martin Seligman's seminal research on learned helplessness was, in dogs and rats and eventually humans. He found, and his colleague found after many years, that it's actually the exact reverse, that our default response to trauma is hopelessness. But what is learned, it's not learned helplessness, it's learned hopefulness.
Hmm.
So we can learn hopefulness through, deliberate taking control um, of our processing, and how we process our intrusive thoughts, how we process our traumas, in ways that we can grow from in many different domains, from creatively to spiritually to relationships, to feeling increased sense of purpose, to wanting to help inspire others, to increase to new strengths. A lot of people discover that they had strengths they never knew they had, or they even just have the strength for resiliency that they never knew they had.
Right.
And that in and of itself can be a really profound realization of oneself.
Along those lines, uncertainty is a pretty, I would argue it's just the inherent quality of life in general. But there are times and places where that's more obvious and perhaps more pronounced than it is at other times and in other places. And certainly with COVID, we've been living in a very uncertain time for lots of
Mhm.
reasons. One of my favorite quotes from your book is from the mathematician John Allen, I guess Paulus, is that how you pronounce it? Who said, "Uncertainty is the only certainty there is, and knowing how to live with uncertain insecurity is the only security." So why is that so important,
Oh, so
especially in
important.
this day and age?
Wanting to thinking that you have control to the extent, or expecting. I think like a lot of people expect control, at least before COVID, and now one upside of COVID, I think, is that people are going to lax their control a little bit, maybe appreciate just the things that come to them more, things that come to them organically and spontaneously. Um, it's, I mean, if it's just from like a nerdy psychological perspective, there's an idea called psychological entropy, which can be likened to entropy of any other system, like a thermodynamic system, where more disorder um, in the system really can lead to dysfunction of the system. In humans, more we have, the more we feel like we can't manage all the uncertainty coming at us, the more likely we're going to be prone to depression, prone to anxiety, prone to physical system breakdown. It affects the epigenetics, it affects um, lots of things. It affects the brain, it affects the neurons, et cetera, et cetera. So, if we can learn how to manage uncertainty, this is going to be the most important skills that a human could possibly learn, you know, and almost accepting it, not just manage it, but learn to accept all the uncertainties that arise. And I think at a very high level of consciousness, one starts to even get excited by uncertainty and move right towards it.
That's absolutely been the case in my experience. And uh, as I noted before, some of the most transformative changes for me have occurred after moments of, traumatic incidents or moments of great uncertainty where I didn't know what life was had in store for me, and there was a lot of stress behind that. But necessity became the mother of invention, so to speak, and new pathways were opened up by that uncertainty. Whereas when I was so certain or so sure of what I thought the outcome should be, or at least I believed I knew what it should be, then I'm not paying attention to what else is there and what else is available. I just want to make a distinction. You said it very clearly, but I think often when we think of controlling uncertainty, we think of controlling controlling it to make it more to make life controlling life to make it more certain. Like what are the variables that we can, kind of cement our control around to hold on to that certainty. But I don't think that's what you're saying. You're saying managing our relationship to uncertainty, or managing how we respond to uncertainty, more so than trying to control those variables.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and you see the extreme manifestation of that in people with like OCD,
Mm-hmm.
and well, there's a wide range of again, I don't like the word disorder, but there are a wide range of disorders, that diagnosed disorders that make it more likely that you'll have psychological entropy much quicker, much faster. So people who score high neuroticism would prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. They almost, in psychological things, they will take the worst outcome immediately than the potentially even worse outcome. But
Right.
it's that uncertainty that causes them to even make self-destructive decisions.
Mm-hmm. Because there's just the potential for ruminating over all of the
Hmm.
other worse outcomes
Hmm.
is more odious than just an outcome that is bad right away.
That's
Huh.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So this I think also comes back to context. We talk, I think something you said before that I recognized, but it was in the flow of the conversation. I didn't want to stop. Was so many of these of what we call disorders, and I want to include chronic, any kind of chronic illness, autoimmune disease, any kind of ongoing chronic health problem in this bucket. They're context dependent, right? Where I think I don't know if this is from your book. I love Eric Fromm, and I've come
Me
across
too.
this quote a few different times, but to be sane in an insane society is itself a marker of insanity, which is really just gets right to it. Is like, you know, if we're living in this modern world where you've got environmental toxins, air, water pollution, traffic, and high stress environments, and just processed and refined foods, on all sides of us, and then you've got like technology companies that are trying to harvest our attention and sell it to the highest bidder. And
Yeah.
it's kind of amazing in some ways to me that anybody is healthy and well and thriving in this kind of
Mm.
environment, because the context itself is so unhealthy. And um, I wonder sometimes whether, like, some of these things that we call disorders in a different context, like let's imagine someone going back to ADHD that is living in a tribal environment where there's, and they're not being a kid is not expected to sit in a school and like shift their attention when the bell rings. Like they get really absorbed in something, then the bell rings and they're supposed to go on to something else, and they're learning stuff that's totally out of context, and they're labeled as having a disorder because they don't want to sit still and focus on that. But in a totally different environment, like in a tribal kind of ancestral environment, that person could have become the shaman, or they may have been gifted hunter or protector of because their attention was always on the horizon, so to speak. And I think that so often with illnesses and with what we call disorders, they're so highly context dependent, and we often leave that out when we talk about them.
I agree. Completely agree.
So what have you got on the horizon, Scott? You mentioned you're working on this book with Jordan, with, positive
It's a
medicine
workbook. It's a workbook.
concept, the workbook. And what else? I'm curious, what other irons do you have in the fire right now?
Well, something that might be a great synergy between us is I'm putting together a certification coaching program for self-actualization coaching.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I'm really excited about that. And have again Robert's feedback on that. I know he helped you a little bit with your
Yeah,
course, and
he's on the
uh,
faculty actually of our
yeah,
course, so we're very lucky to have
yeah,
him.
he's wonderful. Putting together a team of top-notch positive psychology coaches to help with that design of that. So I'm really excited about that, and also excited about the other offerings we're making with our center for the science of human potential, such as maybe a self-actualization coaching program for educators. Um,
Cool.
Down the road would be so cool to help teachers see themselves as coaches as opposed to teachers, you know, teacher
Absolutely.
slash coaches, both.
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that just lifelong learners and growers and developers of all kinds, of self
Mm,
and others. Yeah, that's great. Let's stay in touch about that.
mm,
I think coaching has so much potential,
I agree.
with, and I've been in therapy many times in my life. I have appreciation for psychotherapy and what it can offer. So I'm not saying this as a dig against psychotherapy. I have many friends who are therapists, and
I love
it's
all the
it's great.
disclaimers. I love the
Yeah,
disclaimer.
yeah. And
My
there's
dog's a
something. And
psychotherapist. It's great.
my dog has been in no, my dog
Yeah.
has not been in psychotherapy. I know that happens, but my dog has not been. So, but
Yeah.
coaching is really
Yeah.
interesting to me because of that focus on
I agree.
building on what's working, cultivating strengths, um, learning to build resilience and grit. And I just, if COVID did one thing, it made it so apparent how necessary those skills are for just
Mm.
thriving and flourishing in life.
I couldn't agree more. I am sold. I'm sold on the idea of or the value of coaching done well. It's a very unregulated industry. So
Yes,
there's all sorts of people. I've been really blessed to know people in the field who I can bring together an A+ team of people who really have their heart in it to help people. And yeah, I think that it'll be a nice horizon for me. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, excited to learn more about that. And,
Yeah.
I agree with you. Coaching has been kind of the Wild West up until recently.
Yeah,
And,
that's for
and then
sure.
and health coaching has fortunately seen some really positive developments there. There's now a national board for health and wellness coaching that defines the scope of practice. And they teamed up with the National Board of Medical Examiners, who determines the scope of practice and licensing requirements of, for specialty board certifications like gastroenterology, rheumatology, et cetera. So there's been some needed and appreciated rigor that's been recently added to the
Good.
field, and our program is one of the few that's fully approved by the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaches. So
Congratulations.
I'm thanks. Yeah, I share your advocacy for coaching, and I share also what I assume we
Yeah.
share, that the desire to elevate
Elevate the
coaching,
quality.
the
Yeah.
quality of it to where it can be. I mean, you have people like Robert Biswas Diener who
Yes.
are coaching and approaching it with
Yeah.
that a level of rigor and quality that is just, is incredible,
I
amazing.
strive. I strive
And
for that.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we want to achieve. And then there are lots of programs, unfortunately, out there that are just kind of a weekend training, and they don't actually even really teach those core coaching skills of asking powerful questions, and deeply connecting with the person that you're working with, and the things that are so important to building that, dare I say, therapeutic relationship that
Yeah.
that
In a,
that
in
can
a, in a Carl
happen.
Rogers sense,
Yeah,
in a person-centered sense.
unconditional positive
Yeah.
regard. That's like the
Exactly.
key thing in coaching. So
So
on our
I've been
side,
so yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I've been so impressed with how much like we have mutual interests at such a nerdy level. So I love it.
Yeah, we got to stay in touch for sure. And I deeply grateful for your time coming on the show. I know the listeners can get a lot out of this. Where can people keep up with you and find out more about your work, and just kind of
Cool.
stay abreast of what you're doing?
So you can go to scottbarrykaufman.com. And I have a podcast. It's called the Psychology Podcast, and I love talking to people on that on there. And yeah, but Scott Barry Kaufman, I think, or also humanpotential.co. You can go there and find out about our new center. Hey, thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate this opportunity. I didn't even realize the full extent of how much overlap there was in our passions. So I feel
Uh,
very energized.
Yeah, I think I had a better sense of it than you did because I read your
Mm.
book. So,
Fair enough.
and as I was reading, I see all of the authors that we both know and love, and some similar quotes,
Mm.
I have to say, I read about 4 books a week generally, and I have for years and years. And your book Transcend was one of my favorite books that I've read in a very long time. And
Wow.
I was
Wow.
talking my wife's ear off and I think I highlighted about half of it because I read on Kindle, and because I can highlight, and then I can export those highlights to like Evernote, and then I can
Right.
go back and review the highlights. And I think when I printed out the highlights, it was like 40 pages of highlights. I'm like, wait a second, this is like a third or a quarter of the book.
I do that too.
So
I do that too with books.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's
That's
definitely a
nice.
lot of synergies and interest, and I'd love to stay in touch. And
Yeah.
thank you again. And I highly recommend Scott's book, everybody. Transcend. You can get it at Amazon and all the places.
Thank you, Chris.
It's if you liked this podcast, you will love the book for sure. So Scott, would love to
Thank
have
you.
you back on at some point. Maybe
Yeah, brother.
some of these projects you're working on now have come to more fruition. We can talk a little bit more about them.
Sounds good to me, Chris.
Great.
Just I'd be delightful to stay in touch. Thanks.
Great. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Keep sending your questions in to chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.